The rain had not stopped all night. By the morning of June 18, 1815, the battlefield near Waterloo had turned into deep mud. French artillery wheels sank into the ground, while exhausted horses struggled to pull cannons forward through soaked fields. Smoke drifted across the hills ahead as thousands of soldiers waited silently beneath dark clouds. And somewhere beyond the ridge, the armies of Europe were waiting. Napoleon Bonaparte had returned from exile only months earlier, and now nearly every major power on the continent wanted him destroyed forever. Across the battlefield stood the army of the Duke of Wellington, while another massive Prussian force was already marching toward the battle. Napoleon understood the danger perfectly. If he lost here, his empire would die. But as the battle began, the situation was already becoming catastrophic because Waterloo was not turning into another victory. It was turning into the end of Napoleon himself. After escaping exile on Elba in 1815, Napoleon marched back into France and shocked Europe. Soldiers sent to arrest him instead joined his army, while King Louis XVIII fled Paris as Napoleon rapidly regained power during what became known as the 100 Days. But Europe reacted immediately. Britain, Prussia, Austria, and Russia formed another coalition against him. Massive armies began mobilizing across the continent because this time they wanted to end Napoleon permanently. Napoleon understood France could not survive another long continental war. His empire was weaker. His enemies were united. Time was running against him. So he made one final gamble: move quickly into Belgium, separate the enemy armies, and destroy them before they could unite together. At first, the plan seemed possible, but everything would now depend on one battlefield near the village of Waterloo. The night before the battle, heavy rain flooded the battlefield completely. Roads became rivers of mud, while fields turned soft beneath thousands of marching soldiers. French artillery crews struggled to move heavy cannons through the soaked ground as horses slipped, pulling equipment forward. Napoleon delayed the main attack for hours because he wanted the battlefield dry enough for artillery fire to become effective. But every hour created another danger. The Prussians were getting closer. Across the battlefield, Wellington positioned much of his army behind defensive ridges near farms like Hougoumont. Many French soldiers could barely see the Allied army wading through the smoke and wet morning air. The atmosphere felt heavy and tense. Exhausted troops stood silently in muddy fields while dark clouds covered the sky above Waterloo. Then finally, the French attack began. French artillery suddenly opened fire across the battlefield as smoke rolled over the hills. Infantry columns advanced through mud toward Allied positions, while brutal fighting exploded around Hougoumont almost immediately. Within minutes, Waterloo descended into chaos. Cannons blasted through packed formations. Horses crashed into collapsing cavalry lines. Wounded soldiers crawled through wet ground while officers screamed orders through smoke and thunderous gunfire. Again and again, French forces attacked. Again and again, the Allied line held. Then Marshal Ney launched massive cavalry assaults against Wellington's army. Thousands of horsemen thundered forward through smoke and mud while the battlefield shook beneath pounding hooves. But the British infantry formed defensive squares. Rows of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder behind bayonets as cavalry circled, desperately searching for weakness. Horses slammed into gunfire. Riders fell across the mud. Entire cavalry attacks collapsed beneath relentless resistance. Still, the Allied line did not break, and now time itself was becoming dangerous. By afternoon, devastating news reached Napoleon's commanders. The Prussians had arrived. Fresh enemy forces began entering the battlefield from the east, forcing Napoleon to divide his army while the fighting around Waterloo continued growing more violent. French troops were redirected constantly as pressure increased from multiple directions. The battlefield became confusion and exhaustion. Smoke covered the hills. Cannons flashed through darkness. Soldiers stumbled through mud surrounded by bodies, broken equipment, and collapsing formations. Cavalry attacks lost momentum while officers struggled desperately to reorganize shattered lines. For the first time in years, Napoleon was losing control of the battle itself. Then came the final gamble. Napoleon committed the Imperial Guard, the most feared soldiers in France, veterans of countless victories. As the Guard advanced through smoke toward the Allied center, many believed the battle could still be saved. If the Imperial Guard broke Wellington's line, Napoleon might still survive Waterloo. The Imperial Guard marched forward through cannon smoke as gunfire exploded across the battlefield. French officers shouted for one final push while exhausted soldiers watched the last reserve of Napoleon's empire advance into the chaos ahead. For years, the Imperial Guard had symbolized French invincibility. Now everything depended on them. But the Allied line held. British and Allied troops unleashed devastating volleys into the advancing Guard, while artillery blasted through the smoke-covered battlefield. Slowly, the legendary formation began falling backward. Then panic spread across the French army. La Garde recule. The Guard retreats. The psychological shock was catastrophic. If the Imperial Guard could retreat, then the battle was lost. Within minutes, the French army began collapsing into full retreat. Soldiers fled through mud-covered roads while abandoned cannons and shattered wagons covered the battlefield behind them. Cavalry pursued retreating formations as the empire that once dominated Europe disintegrated into chaos. Waterloo was not simply a military defeat. It was the final destruction of Napoleon's empire. Soon after the battle, Napoleon abdicated again and was exiled to St. Helena. This time, there would be no return. And in the mud near Waterloo, Napoleon lost everything.